in the wake of the pandemic, there have been a lot of companies that have organized, and a lot of conversations about the fact that, during the pandemic, the dancers maybe didn't have any say in what the protocols were for, keeping their workplace safe and what they could or couldn't do. And, that they wanted to make sure if hopefully it never happens again, but if something like that ever happens again, that, that they do have a role to play in what it looks like to go back to work in that situation.
Hello, and welcome to Art Restart, where we explore how artists are reinventing their fields and building a new landscape for the arts. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, the producer and editor of this podcast, which is brought to you by the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. In this episode, we'll be speaking with union organizer and former dancer Griff Braun. Now, if you've listened to a few of our episodes, you'll know that a major theme we often discuss on Art Restart is the fact that audiences or consumers, institutions, businesses, and sometimes even artists themselves often fail to recognize that art is labor, that it is not a pastime or an unconventional way to earn a living. A recent labor action by America's premier ballet company served as a fresh reminder of this. On February 6th of this year, by an overwhelming majority, the dancers and stage managers of American Ballet Theatre voted to authorize a strike. Among their demands were an increase in wages that had been frozen since the Great Recession of 2008, as well as an adjustment to their working hours. Luckily for everyone involved, the ABT company members, represented by their union AGMA, which stands for American Guild of Musical Artists, negotiated with management for about 3 weeks and were able to reach an agreement and avert a strike. So I thought this would be a great time to learn about what it means for a dancer to be unionized, to have negotiating power as a unionized worker, which is why I invited Griff. He is AGMA's National Organizing Director, and as it turns out, he himself was once an ABT company member. He also danced with a number of union and non-union companies, including Laura Lubavitch Dance Company and San Francisco Ballet. And get this, even as a young dancer, he served as a union rep for his fellow company members. Griff spoke to me from his home in West Hartford, Connecticut. He was getting ready to head to Miami to help the dancers of Miami City Ballet in their efforts to unionize. I knew that one of the ballet companies to most recently join AGMA was Dance Theater of Harlem, so I started our interview by asking Griff if he could walk us through how that happened.
It happened the way that it happens at other companies that we organize, where a conversation will happen with between me and one or two or three dancers about just kind of what the union is and how union organizing works. And
so presumably somebody in 2 or 3 people in the company are elected or chosen to represent the dancers in these discussions.
Sometimes there might just be a dancer who independently feels like, there's a need for some change and reaches out to me one way or another through a connection in the dance world, or through sometimes, we have a web page on the AGMA website where anyone can go on and just fill out a simple form if you're interested in learning about organizing for your workplace. And that comes to me, and then I'll reach out for an initial kind of confidential conversation. So, the connection happens in different ways. The dance world is very small, though. And even though I'm, a good bit older than, most of the dancers I'm working with these days, there are still connections there. And a lot of dance companies have been organizing lately. So, they are aware when their colleagues are doing this. And, just a month or so before Dance Theater Harlem won their election, the dancers at Ballet Austin won their election. And, and on over the last few years. There have been several companies that have unionized. So, but usually it starts with that, that first confidential conversation, and I will suggest that that they think about maybe two or three other artists that they think would be interested in hearing about this, and who understand the idea that these conversations need to be confidential, and we'll kind of go from there in terms of building the support necessary to win the union. At Dance Theater of Harlem, there were sort of on and off conversations over a period of a few years until this group of artists decided they would be the ones to bring DTH back into the union. And I say back into the union because Dance Theater of Harlem was an AGMA company for many years. When they closed their doors in the early 2000s, I believe, and then reopened several years later, they reopened as a non-union company. This generation of dancers right now decided they wanted to come back to the union, and to come back to having a voice in their in their working lives.
What role do you think, because you mentioned that there's a lot of unionizing happening in dance companies now, what role do you think the pandemic played in that?
I think it played a role for dancers. I think it played a role for workers generally who, had a moment to kind of step back. They were forced to step back because of the shutdowns, and, decided that, conditions at their workplaces were not what they should be, maybe. Or, if they liked their workplace, they wanted to make sure that it stayed that way. So, I think for dancers, it certainly played a role. And, in the wake of the pandemic, there have been a lot of companies that have organized, and a lot of conversations about the fact that, during the pandemic, the dancers maybe didn't have any say in what the protocols were for, keeping their workplace safe, and what they could or couldn't do. And, that they wanted to make sure if, hopefully it never happens again, but if something like that ever happens again, that, that they do have a role to play in what it looks like to go back to work in that situation. So I think it definitely prompted, some dancers to want to do this. But I think generally, I think there's a movement afoot in the country among workers generally, and I think it was happening even before the pandemic. I'm sure there have been thousands of pages written on this time period and how it's affecting workers. But I certainly think the political landscape played a role in that, starting in 2016. And, the pandemic only amplified it. But there's definitely a lot of momentum within the dance world. And I think part of it is motivated by the bigger picture, the political picture, the pandemic. But I think just as much, if not more, is just within the dance world that, that dancers are seeing that this can be done because, their colleagues at another company did it. And, whether it's, Sarasota Ballet leading to Sacramento Ballet, leading to Nevada Ballet Theatre, leading to Ballet Memphis, Texas Ballet Theatre, Ballet Austin, Dance Theater of Harlem. That's just in the last 2 or 3 years.
Wow.
And there's more to come.
But at the same time, I imagine the first thing that management comes back with is post-pandemic, we're not earning any money. Donations are down, audiences are down. We can't afford to pay our dancers more or to cover greater health insurance. Is that generally what they come back with?
That can be part of it. I think it's sometimes hard for them to say that because everybody's aware that during the pandemic, many of the companies received a lot of funding from the government through the PPP plan, through the Save Our Stages program. And, they received that funding at the same time that the company wasn't working. And so they weren't spending any money. So I think, coming out of the pandemic, I think there's still a question about audiences around the country and what it will mean going forward. But I think many of the companies came out of the pandemic financially pretty sound. What we hear more often, and the money piece is part of it, but we hear more sort of general union busting rhetoric, and it's pretty consistent across the board. And the small arts organizations, dance companies are in many cases no different than Starbucks and Amazon and other large corporations in terms of the vehemence with which they fight back against their workers having a voice. And so the financial piece and crying poor can be part of it, but it's a much larger it's a much larger strategy, often guided by, law firms and so-called union avoidance consultants.
And so, what do they bring up? What are some union busting strategies that are used, particularly with dancers?
Yeah, it's not even particular to dancers. It's very much the same across the board. It's generally the idea that the union is someone else, that it's not you, the worker, that the union is somebody else that's trying to sell you on a service, and you're going to have to spend your money on union dues for that service, and the service doesn't guarantee you anything. As the employer, we don't have to agree to anything that the union wants. And they also will say, if you unionize, it's going to cost the company a lot of money. And dance companies will say things like, it may jeopardize the repertoire that we do, and it may jeopardize our ability to hire this many dancers and to have live music and that sort of thing. The reality is there's no immediate financial cost to a company with their workers unionizing. Whatever the financial burden ends up being, it's based on a negotiation. The artists don't get to dictate what the company does, but they do, as a union, they do have the ability to bargain, and the company is required to bargain with them. That's a huge thing. That's a really important thing.
I wonder if you could tell, because even thinking back on your own experience as a dancer, I think the general public has a certain idea of what a New York ballet dancer looks like and how they
Yeah.
live based on TV and movies, right?
Yeah.
They live off of cigarettes and Diet Coke, tend to an apartment. What might the average American not realize about what the life of a New York ballet dancer is like?
Well, I think the first thing is that virtually none of them smoke anymore. I think that's no longer a thing.
That's good.
Yeah, and that is a good thing. When I first joined ballet theater, and it wasn't that long ago. I mean, it was in the '90s. The lounge still had allowed smoking at the studios. So
Wow.
when you were eating your lunch, you were being covered with cigarette smoke. I think there are almost two worlds here that I would need to kind of address. One is the ballet dancer in New York City that is in New York City Ballet and ABT and the unionized companies. And then there are many ballet dancers in New York City that aren't in companies at all, that are kind of piecing a life together as freelance artists that supplement their work with other jobs, with teaching, with working in restaurants, whatever it might be. I think the tiny apartment stereotype is still true, because it's New York City, and even dancers in the largest union companies, especially in their first 5 to 10 years, are still having roommates and living in tiny apartments in New York City.
What's the pay? Because I have no idea. What's the general kind of pay disparity between a soloist and a company and a corps de
At
ballet
core,
member?
I wish I had a single answer for you. Every contract is different, and that's not to get too far into the weeds, but that's one way that AGMA is perhaps different from some of our sibling unions in the performing arts, like Actors Equity. I think that's probably the one that we're most often compared to. Actors Equity has kind of umbrella contracts that cover work at many different workplaces. So, there's the production contract that covers all of Broadway. And so, if you were asking someone at Actors Equity, what's an ensemble member's minimum pay on Broadway, they could tell you that. At AGMA, we bargain separate collective bargaining agreements with every company. So it's vastly different between New York City Ballet, let's say, which is by far the largest, budgeted dance company in the country, and a company like, Ballet Hispanico, which is a much, much smaller budget company, like a factor of 10, probably smaller. Wages are very different between those companies because, for obvious reasons. So, but in terms of, difference between a core member and a soloist, as I said, it would depend upon the contract. It's going to be, on the order of probably $200-300 a week more for a soloist, maybe. But again, this is real broad spitballing kind of answer, but something like that.
And would you say that a corps de ballet member at Ballet Hispanico, for instance, does she or he get a living wage in New York?
Um, No. And I think part of the reason, and this was actually one of the things I wanted to mention that maybe people aren't aware of for dancers in New York City or professional dancers in ballet or contemporary dance anywhere, is that even in the union companies, none of them are able to provide work for the dancers year round. It's a weekly, kind of seasonal situation. So the larger companies who, are working 36 to 40 weeks a year, let's say, they are able to pay enough that the dancers can live on it. They make a living wage doing that, although they aren't able to save much. I think for companies that work fewer weeks or are smaller budgeted and therefore smaller, lower salaries, I think they often have to supplement their work. That can take a couple of forms. I don't think too many AGMA dancers are working full-time jobs simultaneous to their work. There just wouldn't be time for it. But they're definitely filling in the layoff weeks with other work, whether that's performing in smaller companies or teaching or just working another job altogether. And that, along with unemployment benefits, help them piece together a living.
Why do you think fewer contemporary dance companies are unionized than ballet companies?
I think there are a couple of reasons for that. I think one is just a cultural thing that the contemporary companies have typically not been union companies and just don't associate with it, and perhaps don't even realize that they could be unionized. I think perhaps the bigger aspect is just the disparity in the budget. I mean, there are very few contemporary companies out there that even approach the budgets of even the smallest ballet companies. There are a few, but not too many. Alvin Ailey, of course, is an exception to that. I mean, their budget is the size of a large ballet company, but they're pretty much the only ones. There are a couple of others out there, and I'm hoping eventually we will bring them into the union. But I know there is a whole world of contemporary dance out there that is largely project based freelance work. And, unionizing in that context is virtually impossible with the state of US labor law. So, and, we could talk about that if you want, but
Sure, let's talk about that.
I think one of the big obstacles that we face as workers in the United States, and of course, as artists that are workers in the United States, is just that, labor law dictates that when we organize, when we unionize, we do it one workplace at a time, one employer at a time, rather than what's called sectoral bargaining, where the dream would be that we organize all dancers, and the job of being a professional dancer is just a union job, no matter where you're working. We don't get to do that yet, and I don't know if we ever will. But so that's what we're faced with, is unionizing one employer at a time. And so, in the context of a project-based freelance, work structure, there's no employer to organize. There are people that are working, one gig at a time for a few weeks here and there. Often it's just a friend who's choreographing something that they bring a group of dancers together. They pay them a little bit of money out of their pockets and they put on a performance, and then that's it. There's not enough permanence to the work for us to be able to work with them to unionize. Also, there's an economic aspect to U.S. labor law as well, where there's sort of budget thresholds that an employer needs to meet before they fall under the jurisdiction of the National Labor Relations Act, and the sort of the guardrails that go with it. And most of the contemporary companies out there don't meet that. So, that's kind of what we're facing there. That being said, there are some companies out there. I'm not going to name them, but there are some companies out there that I'm hoping to start, working with soon to go down this road, because assuming we get over the hurdles that I just mentioned, there's nothing about contemporary dance per se that doesn't lend itself to unionizing. It's work. It's still work.
So thinking systemically, including, I guess, rewriting labor law, if you had that power, what could be changed so that ballet dancers working today could enjoy and afford the fullest and safest career?
Yeah, I think there are two things, and they're sort of I don't know how realistic they are, but there are two things. And
We're
one,
dreaming now, so dream ahead.
if we're dreaming now, then Congress passes what's called the PRO Act, the Protect the Right to Organize Act, that's been around for a little while, and that would make the path towards unionizing much easier for dancers and for all workers. That's probably not going to happen anytime soon, but that would be one. That would be one thing. I think, and then I think the other thing would be a complete a complete change of mindset for Americans and their government in terms of the value of the arts and how we show that value by funding the arts. That's one of the missing pieces to artists being able to enjoy and afford a full and safe career, is just the constant struggle for an audience and for the funding that comes with it. But again, both of those, wholesale change of U.S. labor law and massive increase in government funding of the arts are both probably not within reach anytime soon.
Looking ahead at the next year, well, I always ask artists this, what are you most looking forward to? In your case, I'm wondering what challenges or opportunities are you most looking forward to?
Well, I'm looking forward to more organizing, and there is more. I can't say in this conversation, but hopefully within the next couple of weeks, there will be more artists who are taking this step, and I'm looking forward to a continuation of what I think is a real change in the labor movement and in the attitude of the public towards labor in this country, for the positive.
So you're really feeling that happening.
Yes, I
Mm.
think it's really happening, and I think the corporate world, the business world, conservative politicians are fighting back with everything that they've got. And so it'll be a year from now. It's, well, in many ways, a year from now is going to be interesting. But there's a real battle going on right now with workers kind of waking up to their collective power, and with employers and industries doing everything they can to fight it, including, I mean, even going so far as SpaceX and Trader Joe's and maybe even Amazon trying to challenge the constitutionality of the National Labor Relations Board, to basically just undercut the few guardrails that workers have, trying to get that declared unconstitutional at the Supreme Court, which, with the Supreme Court, is not out of the realm of reason. So there's a struggle within this country in many ways, of
But
course.
you sound like you're remaining optimistic.
I'm optimistic. I have hope because workers are standing up. But at the same time, I think we're all on pins and needles about the. I'm sorry to go down this sort of dark road, but we're all on pins and needles about kind of the basic structure and direction of the country, and whether it will continue on a path that allows workers to advocate for themselves, that allows kind of basic democratic functions, which is what labor unions are. I mean, it's labor unions are democracy in action in the most pure form. And we're looking at a possible world. I don't think it will happen, but a possible world where that's not a thing anymore. you know so yeah, I'm trying to remain optimistic, though, just based on the fact that so many workers are coming together right now, and that by most recent surveys, most Americans support labor unions in numbers that we haven't seen in decades, probably since before the 80s.
What's inspiring you these days in your work?
In each organizing campaign with each group of artists that I work with, sometimes for as long as a year or more before the group is ready to move forward and win their union. With each group, I'm inspired by the artists that kind of find their voice and step up. And I think that's particularly true for dancers because, as you probably know, especially ballet dancers, from a very young age, 5, 6, 7 years old, they're told what to do and what to look like and what their body should look like and where to stand and where to look and not to speak up and to just do what they're told. And
yeah, it's like joining the armed forces.
Yeah, and that happens from such a young age that by the time they enter the career, they are sort of trained that way, that they're not supposed to speak up. And so, with each group of artists that I work with that gets to that point of, unionizing, voices emerge and people find, they find the sort of internal fortitude to speak up in a way that they haven't before. And by standing together, they kind of find a voice that maybe has been suppressed for a long time. And so that never fails to inspire me. The individuals that come forward and turn into leaders and carry the ball once they unionize and they go into contract negotiations. And it changes. I think it changes the artists, and it certainly changes the workplace for the better for them, but also for every artist that follows them in that particular company.
And also because I imagine for a long time, companies felt like they had a lot of power because most of their dancers were A, very young, and B, largely female.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I see non-union ballet companies that I work with where the female dancers are paid a lot less than the male dancers, just because just in, the last couple of years, I can think of one or two ballet companies that I won't name them, but that, have unionized where that was a big issue for them, where they, first of all, they often come to me and they don't know what their colleagues make in terms of wages. And so I very often have to kind of prompt them to ask each other, start having that conversation, because, sometimes it feels sort of taboo to ask someone how much money they make. But,
sure.
But that's really a way to make sure workers never know if they're underpaid or not. And so I encourage them to talk to each other, find out what you're making if you don't know. And, sometimes what they find out is that the women make a lot less than the men. And, sometimes directors will say flat out, well, there are just a lot more women to choose from, so we don't have to pay them as much. So, that's definitely there. And you're right, ballet dancers are young when they enter this profession, sometimes 17 years old when they're going into the workforce. And so, not only have they been sort of trained not to speak up from the time they were, young children, but they're still children in many ways. They're still, very young entering the professional world. So, but this exercise of the organizing process and having these conversations with their colleagues, really thinking about the job of being a dancer and what, how they would like it to be better, how they would like the workplace to be better. That process really helps them sometimes find their voice in a really inspiring way.
If you'd like to learn more about Griff and read a longer written version of this interview, please head to uncsa.edu/artrestart. I am always happy to hear listener suggestions about artists and themes you'd like us to cover. So if you have any ideas, please hit me up on Instagram at PCTalenti. Our theme music is by Shanghai Restoration Project. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, and on behalf of the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts, thanks for listening.